Homelessness is worsening over time.
If you don't have a home, you really can't focus on other parts of your life.
Our children are our future because we are the present.
You're one really bad day away from being homeless.
Folks that you walk past on the street, they're somebody's family member.
Housing, education, people. Those are game changers. We have the money, the intellect, the passion. We can do this.
Hi, my name is Hannon, and I'm the host of The Bells I Hear, an audio and video podcast that aims to raise awareness about the homelessness crisis in New York City and the complexity surrounding the issue. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today we have Brian Goldstone joining us. He's a journalist and the author of There's No Place for Us. It's a book that tells the deeply personal story of 5 families in Atlanta, all of which are working and homeless in America. Hi, Brian. It's such a pleasure to have you on today on our show.
It's great to be with you too.
Yeah, I guess we can just sort of jump right into it. Curious to know, what inspired you to tell this story? Was there a moment or something that happened that sort of ignited your interest in sort of digging deeper into the subject?
Yeah, so the story for me actually began with my wife. My wife, Elaine, is a nurse practitioner, and back in about 2017, 2018, she was working at a community health center here in Atlanta where we live called Mercy Care. And she began to notice this trend among the patients she was seeing. Her patients were working in Amazon warehouses. They were working at Walmart, McDonald's. They were driving for Uber and Lyft. And when they finished their shifts, they weren't going to an apartment. They were sometimes sleeping in the very cars they had just done airport runs or delivered food in their cars, or they were going to shelters if there were any shelter beds available, or they were going to these squalid extended stay hotels. And my wife was just shocked at this, this trend she was seeing of people who were both working and homeless. When she told me about it, I have a background in anthropology, but at that point I had also begun to work as a journalist. I had been reporting on stories around the world, often involving economic injustice and equality. This was something that was unfolding in my backyard. My first foray into the subject, investigating this phenomenon of the working homeless, as I began to call it, was a magazine piece that I wrote for the New Republic magazine. I reported that over the course of about 7 months, following one family, a mom who's a home health aide. And by the time I met her and her kids, they had been homeless for about 3 or 4 months. After that story came out, I think a lot of readers were just shocked, kind of stunned at this term working homeless, that it could even exist in the richest nation on the planet. And I realized that I had only scratched the surface of what there was to sort of unpack and investigate. And so that led me to then want to expand that article into a book where I follow 5 families, as you mentioned.
You do mention that you have a background in anthropology. So how did that sort of shape your approach when working with these 5 families to tell their story?
Yeah, I definitely approached this much less as a typical journalist might, where you kind of drop in, you know what the story is that you're looking for, you know what the interviews are that you're looking for, and then you kind of get out and you write it up. I approach this much more as I might ethnographic field work. As I mentioned, I was an anthropologist before I became a journalist. Much of my field work for many years was in West Africa, in rural northern Ghana, where I had just sort of immersed myself in the world of, in the case of my research at that time, of West African Pentecostalism, religion, spirituality, and psychiatry, mental health. Those were the things I was looking at back then. And for this project, I approached it in much the same way, even though geographically, it was much closer in proximity to where my family and I live. So I basically just wanted to throw myself as much as humanly possible into the day-to-day lives of the 5 families I followed. That meant just being with them all the time, as much as I possibly could. I went with them to meetings with child welfare investigators and caseworkers. I went with them to food pantries and church, and I was with them on Christmas Eve for family gatherings. I was just with them as much as I could. And, that was a very tall order. I've been asked since the book came out, how did I pick the families who I ended up following? And I would say that it was much less a matter of me picking them than The question of like, who is going to allow me into their life, into their world in this way? For people who are completely maxed out, who are dealing with unbelievable stress, unbelievable anxiety about just meeting their most basic material needs, about where are they going to be sleeping with their children from one night to the next. It was a lot to ask, can I just be with you? And so a lot of families who for a while I thought might be in the book, they ended up just not having the space, understandably, absolutely understandably, for someone to be trailing them. And so that was kind of the process of how I ended up following these 5 families in particular, because for them, like, there ended up being a kind of, I don't know how to call it, kind of I think it was helpful for them in a way, lacking a wider support system, to have someone to process their feelings with, to have someone to call at 1:00 in the morning to vent about the latest indignity they had suffered at the office trying to seek assistance, and so on and so forth. So that was kind of how I ended up doing this.
How important was it for you to sort of like immerse yourself in their lives? Because you could have easily just like interviewed them, asked them questions, but you clearly, I mean, I'm sure it was an intentional decision for you to go out and like experience their lives with them. So yeah, how important was that for you in the direction of like, telling their stories?
Yeah, for me, it was extremely important to show people in the fullness of who they are and who they aspire to be. A lot of academic research and reporting on poverty and homelessness in America, it tends to show people only at their most anguished moments, only at their lowest moments, their moments of crisis. And, and that's just a tiny sliver of who they are as human beings. I wanted to show them with all of their desires, all of their hopes, all of their aspirations. I wanted to show them kidding around with each other, just like joking, having dinner together. One of the family stories in the book opens on Christmas Eve when Michelle, the mom, is wearing a Santa hat and she's making Christmas Eve dinner for her kids. The chapter ends in a very undramatic way. It just ends with her and her fiance and her children making a gingerbread house. It felt very, very important to capture those moments, because not only as a way of showing them in their full humanity, but also I think that it's harder for readers or for observers to fully appreciate the anguished moments, to fully appreciate what is lost if you aren't already familiar with what was there before. Without widening the time span, I think it's just hard to fully grasp the magnitude and pain, the suffering of what ensued. And also to show how absolutely preventable and avoidable their suffering was. It did not have to happen this way, but sometimes if you only capture people in that moment of crisis, you don't get a sense of how avoidable it was and all the little tiny steps that could have prevented this. And if I could just say one more thing about, kind of immersing myself in this way and showing them in all of their moments. A number of readers have remarked that the book doesn't just present people as these angelic, heroic victims. I think that it can be just as dehumanizing to show people as flawless, as perfect, to try to smooth off all of the decisions that they themselves recognize as bad decisions, or the things that they themselves recognize as shortcomings. I think that can be just as dehumanizing as purely pathologizing people, as so much discourse on those suffering from poverty and homelessness in America tends to do. And so I think that showing people who, in sort of the reality of who they actually are, is a way of humanizing them. And yeah, so that was also really important, just to, ultimately the goal was that readers would not just intellectually know and understand, but they would feel in a very visceral way what it's like for parents, for their kids, when this most basic human necessity, a roof overhead, is constantly out of reach.
Yeah, it's important to strike that balance of like, yeah, this person
as human, like they make mistakes, they're not perfect, and also like you'll like see yourself in them, and then you'll see maybe people within them, which helps you connect with them. So yeah, I think that's really great. In the book, you focus on 5 families from Atlanta. What sort of drew you to focus on Atlanta? Because obviously a lot of cities around the world, countries are being gentrified, and the homelessness crisis is skyrocketing everywhere. So what made you decide on Atlanta?
Yeah, so much of the media coverage and academic research on homelessness and the housing crisis tends to be centered on a kind of predictable set of cities: LA, San Francisco, New York. And so, one way of answering that question of why Atlanta is just that people across the country are feeling the housing and homelessness crisis, not just people in those coastal cities. And so it seemed important to show that statistics bear that reality out, that, for instance, according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, there isn't a single state, city, or metro area in the entire country where a full-time minimum wage worker earning the local minimum wage, not the federal minimum wage, the local minimum wage, can afford just a modest 2-bedroom apartment. So that is something that people are dealing with, not just in LA or San Francisco, but in any number of other cities, including Atlanta. Part of the reason I focused on Atlanta was because of how kind of unique it is in the history of housing policy in this country. Atlanta has kind of stood out as a laboratory of sorts. Atlanta was the first city in the country during the 1930s to build public housing. And during the 90s and 2000s, Atlanta became the first city in the country to begin demolishing all of its public housing. Part of why Atlanta is because of its uniqueness. But I would say the bigger reason why Atlanta is because of how representative the city is. As you mentioned, gentrification is a big part of the story that I'm telling in this book, and a big part of what I am arguing is fueling this epidemic of homelessness and housing precarity. Over the last decade or so, Atlanta, like many cities, has undergone a much celebrated renaissance, this really dramatic transformation of its urban center. What we've seen is that corporate profits are surging, unemployment has been at a historical low, the signs of growth are everywhere, and yet paradoxically and really perversely, the very workers who are making that growth possible, they are being pushed out not just of the neighborhoods they grew up in, as their neighborhoods become gentrified and as property values skyrocket, but increasingly those workers are being pushed out of housing altogether. That phenomenon, the fact that this crisis is less one born of poverty than of prosperity, that it's occurring not amid a failing economy, but amid a booming economy, that phenomenon is true in Nashville, in Charlotte, in Chicago, in any number of cities across the country, Austin, Denver, Phoenix. And so again, Atlanta is really representative here. And I think the fact that the families I'm following in this book really are the sort of casualties of this renaissance of urban space, that is a phenomenon that is true across the country. I think it really forces us to rethink our association of homelessness with poverty. Again, I argue that this is really more a product of a particular kind of prosperity, one that puts ever more profits and wealth in the pockets of some at the expense of the many, many more who are just desperate for something as basic as a place to live.
You broke it down incredibly well. It's this like incredibly vicious cycle where the people that are helping to put money in the pockets of corporations and, people at the top, they're suffering. And that's it's just not fair. It's very unjust. And, you mentioned in the book how people are actually being pushed into homelessness and not falling into it. I guess, yeah, how does this challenge people's original perception?
Yeah, if I could just speak really quickly to what you just mentioned, you said it's not fair. It's not fair. And that is the response I'm hoping to in readers, the sense that, homelessness, as we've tended to treat it and think about it, since the 1980s when mass homelessness first erupted in this country, at best, it is seen as an issue or question of charity, that, we need to have more compassion for those who are suffering in this way. And at worst, it's been treated as a problem to solve through criminalization and banishment and brutalizing those who are trapped in this insecurity. But I think that is a kind of blackmail, that we have to choose between either charity or pathologizing. When we talk about fairness, when we frame it as a phenomenon where the very people who, again, are making the growth of our cities possible through their labor, through their work, are being pushed into homelessness, then we see it not as a question of charity, but a question of justice. And so that is a reframing that I'm really hoping this book accomplishes, that we will stop thinking of homelessness as something that, that we just need more empathy. That is true. We need empathy, but we also need anger. We need outrage at the ways that our comfort, our happiness, our fulfillment as wealthier residents of the American city has been made possible through this kind of insecurity. There is a very intimate relationship between those two things. And it makes me think of this Toni Morrison quote. She gave a commencement speech at Sarah Lawrence College during, I believe, in the 80s. This quote could in many ways be the epigraph to this book. She says something to the effect of, imagine, envision, if your fun, your happiness, your enjoyment was not predicated on the deprivation of another. And I think that framing homelessness as a condition that has been generated by the growing wealth, comfort, enjoyment of an entire class of people in this country at the expense of an entire other class of people, a much larger, as it happens, class of people, is something that is long overdue in our discussions of homelessness.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting that you brought that up. Like, it is generated. Like, this is, like, there are intentional decisions being made by people that are willing to sacrifice other people's livelihood, their ability to secure safe, stable housing. And it really, like, begs the question of, who gets to, who has a right to housing? Like, who gets to live comfortably? And who gets to make that decision as well? Because all of us sort of deserve access to that. So, yeah.
I mean, the precarity that I document in this book, the pain, the anguish that these families experience in the course of their journeys, it is the predictable outcome of very concrete policy decisions that have been made. And I think that's just important to emphasize. It is the predictable outcome. Yeah. This is not tragic in the classic sense of tragedy, as something that was unforeseen. This is the logical, predictable outcome of very particular decisions that have been made. And I think we have to recognize that.
Yeah, yeah. You know, in the book, you sort of mentioned that people that are working yet are still experiencing homelessness live in the shadow realm. Could you sort of delve into what that means?
Absolutely, yeah. I was kind of stunned as I began this reporting to discover that there's this entire world of homelessness that exists out of sight. I refer to it as a kind of shadow realm. When most Americans think of homelessness, they think of a homelessness that is conspicuous, that is sort of in their face. In many ways, that conspicuous homelessness, street homelessness, the tent encampments, they have been targeted for criminalization and banishment because it sort of disrupts, or is purported to disrupt, is said to disrupt the everyday lives of those who encounter it on their way to work or in the subway. And that creates a certain degree of discomfort for those who are not unhoused. But, what I try to argue is that the tents are really the tip of the iceberg. In many ways, my book is about this much, much bigger portion of the iceberg that is under the water's surface, that is not just invisible, but that has been actively rendered invisible. This is a manufactured invisibility. And, the invisibility is like the kind of physical fact. I mean, these are people who precisely don't want to be seen as homeless. They don't want to be identified as such. And so they will do everything they can to hide that fact, even from their family members and coworkers, because they don't want people to know that they're in this situation. They're also physically out of sight because they are in their cars or they are doubled up with others in overcrowded apartments. A big sort of argument in the book is that extended stay hotels and motels have become a critical site in the ecosystem of America's new homelessness. And so these hotels are also places that are, kind of warehousing ever larger portions of America's homeless population, largely families with children. But they're not just out of sight. They're not just invisible in that kind of physical way. They're also invisible in terms of how we count homelessness. The families I write about in this book, they literally don't count. Every year when the federal homeless census is conducted, families like them are written out of the story. The federal point in time count, which I took part in as part of this reporting, it only counts those who are physically visible on the street and those who are in homeless shelters. So in a place like Atlanta, where family homeless shelters are virtually non-existent, and this is true across the country, in this sense, New York is really exceptional because, in New York, there's a right to shelter. And so there's this kind of sprawling shelter system that has emerged as a result of that. But in the rest of the country, if you're a family with children and you're homeless, chances are you're not going to be in a shelter and you're not going to be on the street. You're going to be in one of these other sites and places, and that is the shadow realm that I'm talking about. So, just to put a number on it, for the last 2 years, homelessness officially has been at the highest level on record. 2 years ago, it broke a record, and in the most recent year, broke the record yet again. I argue by cobbling together sort of other data sources that a true estimate of those who are currently experiencing homelessness in this country, if we were to include all of the families I write about and the millions of people like them, is roughly 6 times greater than the official number. So close to 4 million men, women, and children who are currently without housing in this country. And excluding them from the official numbers, it's not just a question of, well, it's a larger number than we've been told. It has, I would argue, fateful consequences, not only for their ability to obtain really vital assistance. They are locked out of important assistance because they don't fit this definition of homelessness that sort of arbitrarily has been produced by the federal government. But another fateful consequence is that our perception of the causes of homelessness and the face of homelessness in this country has been, I would argue, drastically distorted as a result of that invisibility and exclusion.
Yeah, you rightfully critique the federal definition of homelessness. It doesn't take into account a large population of people that are experiencing homelessness, but just like not within the shelter system or maybe not in the streets. I guess how would you go about redefining it, making sure that these people are accounted for and that they're able to access these services that are vital for their survival?
Yeah, advocates for families experiencing homelessness and children and youth experiencing homelessness for years have been trying to get the federal government to expand its narrow and in many ways arbitrary definition. So that has been an effort for a while now. Basically, what they want is for HUD. HUD is the federal agency that oversees the homeless census every year. HUD is the federal agency that determines not only the allocation of resources, but who will gain access to resources pertaining to homelessness and housing. But it's not the only federal agency that has a definition of homelessness. The Department of Education, and one of the just absolutely heartbreaking consequences of the decimation of the Department of Education could very well be that our understanding of family and child homelessness will really be impacted, and that the minimal data that exists will go away because the Department of Education has its own numbers on child homelessness, on student homelessness. Year after year, it has been exponentially higher than the number of children purported to be homeless by HUD. But the Department of Education has its own count, and it also has its own definition. It's a much more expansive definition that includes families with children who are in these hotels and motels and families who are doubled up with others. The reason they have that more expansive definition is because teachers and school social workers and principals saw over the years how a child who is living in one of these hotels in just abysmal conditions, or living in overcrowded conditions in apartments with others, are just as vulnerable as children living in other settings like shelters. So they recognize that and have a definition that corresponds with what they know to be the reality of family and student homelessness in this country. Expanding HUD's definition to be in line with what the Department of Education has recognized as homelessness is a very important step to enabling these families to access resources. And I'm happy to describe a moment in the book that is really, really gutting, where Celeste tries to access these resources at the coordinated entry point. But bringing the Department of Education and HUD definitions into alignment, I think, would be a huge first step.
Yeah, I would love if you could delve deeper. I know there was a moment where Celeste, wanted to, in order to qualify for assistance, she would have had to enter the homeless shelter, but her son was over the age of 13 and he would have had to be in a separate shelter. So, yeah, if you could just go a little.
Sure. Yeah, so, Celeste, without getting into her story, because her story is so, just unbelievable. It starts with a house fire. An abusive ex burns down her rental home, and she thinks that she's going to be able to get into housing again relatively quickly, but finds out that her private equity landlord has filed an eviction on her for refusing to pay rent on this house that burned down. And she doesn't find this out until after the eviction has already gone through. The judgment has already been handed down. Her credit has been destroyed. And she's basically locked out of the formal housing market after that. And she goes with her children to an extended stay hotel called Efficiency Lodge, just a really, really awful place. It's where the bulk of my reporting is situated. After being at Efficiency Lodge for a while and realizing how predatory this environment is, how she's paying more than double what she had been paying for her rental house for this studio-sized hotel room, with water leaking from the ceiling and rodents and plugs where if you plug something in, you could get electrocuted, paying more than double for this kind of setting than she was for her apartment. Finally, she's diagnosed with ovarian and breast cancer, and yet she continues to go to her warehouse job because she knows if she doesn't go to her job, she doesn't get paid. And if she doesn't get paid, she and her children will be out of this room on the street. So finally, in desperation, after kind of refusing to put the term homeless on herself and her situation, out of desperation, she fishes out a homeless resource list given to her by the school social worker, and she goes to the coordinated entry point in Atlanta. Every city in America has its own version of Gateway Center, which is Atlanta's coordinated entry point. It's where you have to go to access resources if you're homeless. And so she gets there before dawn, and the line is already snaking around the block in downtown Atlanta. And she is prepared to tell her story. She's come armed with her receipts and documents. And when she finally, hours and hours later, sits in front of the caseworker begins asking her a list of standardized questions. How long have you been on the street? Do you have any behavioral health diagnoses? Have you ever been in jail or prison? What drugs are you addicted to? And so forth. Celeste is saying, no, none, never. None of that applies to me. And she's totally confused. Like, why are all these questions being asked? And finally, at the end of this standardized interview, even after she has told this caseworker about her cancer, she's told that she's not vulnerable enough, that her vulnerability score is too low to access resources, and that her experience of homelessness does not fit the definition of, quote, literal homelessness as defined by HUD, which again is just those who are in shelters or on the street. And Celeste says to the caseworker, okay, so for us to be considered literally homeless, as you put it, we have to go to a shelter. Fine, we'll go to a shelter. I tried getting into a shelter, but there were no shelters available. And the caseworker says, well, actually, there is a shelter that takes families that has some availability. Celeste says, fine, we'll go. And the caseworker, as you mentioned, says to her, well, you mentioned that your son just turned 15. Celeste says, yeah. She says, I'm so sorry. The family shelters here in Atlanta don't allow boys over the age of 13. So he would have to go to a men's shelter on his own. And of course, Celeste isn't willing to do that. So she leaves Gateway Center empty-handed. When she walks out of the building, the line is just as long as it had been that morning, with people desperate for help. I argue that this is no kind of bizarre aberration, what she encountered. This is the experience of scores and scores of families and individuals desperate to obtain resources. And I would say to those listening who maybe at some point have said something like, well, why don't they just go get help? Why don't they just go to a shelter? Why don't they just go get services? And there's even a term that people in the world of homeless services use to describe people who are still on the street or still in their cars. They're labeled service resistant. And that's a way of blaming people for their predicament. And what I would say to that is, you try getting assistance. You try waking up before dawn and going to your city's version of Gateway Center and see how easy it is to get help.
Yeah, it's strange that they would, define them as service resistant. Clearly, in Celeste's case, she was more than willing to get assistance, but was turned away, or there was that obstacle. And it really does shine a light on a broken system, one that works against people that need help. I'm curious to know, do you think that systems are effective in helping people that are more vulnerable or need help? Or do you feel like they are not the solution to the problem?
I would love to talk a little bit more about solutions, because it's such an important question. On the question of systems specifically, sort of our current systems that are designed to help those experiencing homelessness, here I've found it really helpful to take my cues from those who are doing this work. And so there's a person in the book, Carla Wells, who is a case manager. At that time, she was a case manager with an organization called Nicholas House, which deals specifically with family homelessness. Carla has been in the trenches of this work for decades, and her observations are really astute, I think. She in the book is just growing increasingly disillusioned with what she calls the homeless industrial complex. She's just frustrated at the fact that for every one family she's able to help, another 3 or 4 families are turned away. And that for every family that she finally is able to get into housing, another 4 or 5 families are becoming homeless. And, Carla has some really insightful things to say. She points out how, in leaving so much of how homelessness is confronted and addressed to philanthropic organizations.
Yeah, it's strange that they would, define them as service resistant. Clearly, in Celeste's case, she was more than willing to get assistance, but was turned away, or there was that obstacle. And it really does shine a light on a broken system, one that works against people that need help. I'm curious to know, do you think that systems are effective in helping people that are more vulnerable or need help? Or do you feel like they are not the solution to the problem?
They may have a vested interest in not identifying the reasons why people are being pushed into homelessness. They may be philanthropic groups that have made some of their money, in other ways, through real estate or through challenging basic tenant protections. And then they want to help address homelessness. So part of it is who is it that is funding these efforts to address homelessness? At the end of the day, for Carla, this system is simply not doing what it purports to do. At best, it's managing a homelessness crisis instead of ending it. And she says at one point, what my clients need, yes, they need resources. Yes, they need housing subsidies. They need just basic resources to supplement their often poverty wages that they're earning at, again, not just one job that they're working, but 2, 3 jobs that they're working in an effort to meet their needs. Yes, they need money, but what they really need, Carla says, is power. That is what they're lacking. My client, she says, feel powerless, not only to truly ameliorate their plight, their predicament, but to even understand it, to even understand who's the wizard pulling the strings, militating against my security at every turn. They feel powerless to even understand that. And so for Carla, power is what will ultimately solve this problem. And yeah, just to talk about solutions more generally, you alluded earlier to just how housing is treated in this country. And for me, that's where I kind of bring my anthropological perspective, because anthropologists love to make the familiar strange, to take familiar things that we take for granted, and kind of look at them with fresh eyes. And nowhere, I think, is that more urgently needed than when it comes to housing. I remember early on in the pandemic, there were 2 brothers in Tennessee who were going around to all the Dollar Generals they could find and buying hand sanitizer, and then hoarding that hand sanitizer in a U-Haul truck and selling it on eBay and Amazon for $80, $90 a pop. And there was justified outrage at that practice. They were, in newspapers, people were calling for them to be prosecuted. And I remember thinking at that time, that is what we have done to housing in this country. We have allowed it to be hoarded up, put in a kind of U-Haul truck, so to speak, and then auctioned off to the highest bidder. But we don't call that by its proper name, which is price gouging. We call it supply and demand economics. We just say that's capitalism. That's the market. And I think we need to look at that with fresh eyes. I think we need to be shocked that this fundamental human necessity, a roof overhead, has been commodified in this way, has been hoarded in this way. And I think that really has to be at the foundation of any meaningful solution to the housing and homelessness crisis. Anything short of a paradigm shift in how we treat housing in this country, anything short of beginning to treat housing as just a fundamental human necessity and a basic human right, will, I think, just be kind of nibbling around the edges of the problem. It will be putting a Band-Aid. And so that really, I think, is where the most urgent change is needed, just in how we understand this basic human necessity.
Yeah, you touched on so many great points. I think something that definitely stood out is like these systems trap vulnerable families and people, and they feel powerless. It's sort of like a rat race, right? Like you think that you've sort of gotten the help that you need to get out, but then it's like you face another barrier and now you're stuck. And then you also mentioned the price gouging, essentially, of rent rising and people being priced out. And then obviously the income is also stagnating. And so people are not making enough to afford it. Even if they do, it's like ridiculous, right? Do you feel like there's a way that like some of these companies or just like, people at the top can be held responsible? And I don't know, it's sort of, obviously a part of it is like empowering people that are experiencing homelessness or facing challenges, but also like, is there, I don't know, do you see a way where we can, I don't know, challenge those that are doing this, essentially?
Yeah, you are absolutely right to mention the companies that these people are working for, and not just the landlords and private equity firms, Wall Street firms that are jacking up rent. Because when we talk about the working homeless, which, by the way, when I use the term working homeless, this is not intended to draw a kind of moral line in the sand and say that those who aren't working are somehow less worthy of our compassion. Yep. A huge number of workers in this country can't afford a place to live and are becoming homeless or being pushed into homelessness. That is the only sort of reason to talk about this category. But when we do discuss the working homeless, we need to look not only at the homeless side of that equation, which involves housing, of course, but the working side. It's a matter of people earning poverty wages, wages that aren't nearly enough to afford just the cost of living in most American cities. But it's also the nature of the work itself. The work itself has grown ever more insecure, precarious, volatile over the last several years. Entire segments of our economy have been gigafied, have been contracted out. And what that means is that, like Cass in the book, Cass, who's working at the Atlanta airport, she's scrubbing floors, and her employer is not the airport, but it's a third-party contractor who will give her 29 hours a week, because at 30, she would be eligible for just basic benefits like health insurance and sick leave. Or the fact that Celeste, when she had cancer, was having to choose between going to her warehouse job or going to her chemo appointment because she didn't have any sick leave. So yes, it's that the wages are low, but it's also the nature of work. And so I think that our attention, if we are interested in meaningfully addressing this, has to be not only on the housing part of it, but also on, who are these people working for? Why is it that Uber and Lyft have deliberately made it such that their workers are not classified as employees, but as independent contractors? Why is it that Kara, who in the book is delivering food for DoorDash, was not an employee for DoorDash with all of the benefits that would imply? So I think we have to hold these companies accountable. They are making record profits. Their shareholders are seeing their wealth increase astronomically, while the people who are generating that wealth are barely hanging on. So yes, there needs to be accountability. There needs to be accountability for landlords. There needs to be accountability for employers. But where that comes from, I think will inevitably have to come from the bottom. It will have to come from those who are closest to the problem. I really believe that it's those who are closest to the problem that are best equipped to show us a way forward, to get us out of this. And I think that I've drawn hope personally and inspiration from a vibrant tenant rights movement and the housing justice movement that has emerged in this country over the last several years. During the pandemic, when there was an eviction moratorium, which not only kept millions of people in their homes, but literally saved lives, because there was public health research that showed that being evicted during the pandemic could actually lead to death. That eviction moratorium came about not because some policymaker decided to help these tenants out, but because tenants themselves demanded it, because they said, this is intolerable. And I really think that's where the pressure will come from to bring this change. There are tens of millions of people in this country who are now trapped in what I refer to as the semi-permanent renter class. And this is not just a marginal population, it's a huge population. Something like 53 million American workers right now, the overwhelming majority of them renters, who are making less than $10.30 an hour in their jobs. This is a huge population, and it's through them demanding that their struggle be taken seriously that change will come about.
Yeah, yeah. Literally like power in the people, power in numbers, just challenging the system. We see homelessness as a major issue due to like lack of affordable housing. That's something that we see here in New York City. And families need to qualify for some of the few available units that are, deemed affordable. And this is true in like luxury buildings, even though affordable isn't necessarily like truly affordable.
That's right.
And I know that you do argue that that we need to stop discriminating against voucher holders and start enforcing this. I guess what policies or changes in the system do you believe would have the most immediate impact?
Yeah.
Challenge.
So, I intentionally started with a more abstract necessity to have a kind of paradigm shift societally around how we think about housing. But there are also very concrete solutions right now that can ease people's suffering, that can really ease this crisis. If it is true, as I argue, that what I'm documenting in this book is the inevitable, predictable outcome of very particular policies, then the opposite has to be true, that there are very particular concrete policies that can stop this. And so, I kind of put solutions in two big buckets. One of them is getting people into housing, obviously, that they don't yet have. getting people out of homelessness. And that can take the form of, yes, of course, obviously, like building more, creating more truly affordable housing, not just affordable housing in name, but not in reality, but truly deeply affordable housing that low-wage workers can afford. So many of our sort of market rate apartment complexes, when affordable housing is included, it's like 15% of apartments at 70%, 80% AMI, which is not the population that I'm talking about. It is not those 53 million workers making less than $10.30 an hour. So it needs to be truly affordable, but also really basic things like here in Georgia, as in many states, landlords can charge applicants who are trying to get into an apartment anything they want just to apply. So in Georgia, we're seeing this phenomenon where landlords are charging $80, $90 per adult who's applying for an apartment, plus a $200, $150 administrative fee. All of that money is non-refundable. Even if you are rejected, you have to pay it up front. It's basically extortion. It's just legalized extortion. It's saying you are desperate for something and we are going to squeeze you for everything we possibly can. New York has laws that cap those kinds of fees, but New York, again, is exceptional. The rest of the country, it's kind of the Wild West, and landlords can basically do anything they want. They can get away with, in Georgia until recently, there wasn't even a law mandating the habitability of apartments. So that's why Celeste was able to have an eviction filed on her on a home that had literally burned down, that was uninhabitable. So these are like very basic things that can get people into homes easier, banning these application fees, offering, banning, as you mentioned, discrimination against voucher holders. That's something that we have seen not just in Atlanta, but across the country, where landlords will deny someone who has a voucher simply because of a stigma surrounding vouchers, but also because it's not in their financial interest to, because they know they can squeeze more rent out of a non-assisted tenant. And so there are all sorts of things like that that can just help people get into housing faster. But the other big bucket is keeping people in the homes they already have. And in some ways, that is the piece that is often missing from our discussion of homelessness. I've gone to conferences on homelessness where 90% of the discussion was getting people into treatment, helping their behavioral health issues, finding landlords who will rent to people coming out of homelessness. Very little discussion of stopping homelessness from happening to begin with. And those are kind of upstream solutions that are absolutely necessary, because in cities across the country, like I said, for every one person who gets into housing, another 3-4 people are becoming unhoused. So how do we stop that relentless churn? We stop it through a right to counsel in eviction cases where tenants have a lawyer on their side, like they would in a criminal case. We stop it through ensuring that apartments have to be habitable, because when people refuse to pay rent on an apartment, an eviction is filed against them, and then they no longer have a home. So we have to ensure that homes are not just affordable, but dignified and safe as well, because that keeps people in those homes. We have to think about gentrification and the ways that it fuels displacement. We can't just let the market do its thing, because the market on its own will never be incentivized to take care of the housing needs of poor and working class people in this country. So there needs to be something else that keeps them in their homes. And those are very concrete policies that can be implemented at the city, state, or federal level, depending on the policy in question.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. There's no one really advocating for them. It's not in landlords' best interest to provide affordable rent to working class folks. Having them pay that fee that they're not being refunded is certainly taking advantage of them, and just a way to help them make more profit, which is absurd. In your book, you talk about Section 8 housing, and you sort of call it like the housing Hunger Games. Could you just go a little bit into that?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it does show up in trying to use a Section 8 voucher and not being able to find a landlord who will accept it. But yeah, that term housing Hunger Games comes from Carla Wells, that same case manager who I referenced earlier. And for her, it just describes the process of trying to find a home in this country today, being left essentially to fend for yourself. And I think Hunger Games is kind of the right term because it's brutal. I mean, you have 5, 6 families, individuals competing for a single rental unit, a single apartment. And in conditions like that, Natalia, one of the people in the book, she says at one point, how are they getting away with this? How are they getting away with demanding these application fees? And then she answers her own question, because they can. Because she has been thrown into the housing Hunger Games where anything goes, where the government has essentially stepped away. You know, in the 1980s, one of Reagan's HUD deputies said, the government is getting out of the housing business, period. And that, you could argue, is when the housing Hunger Games really started. Once the government and its attempts to intervene in the market and provide public housing, which is the biggest piece of this whole puzzle, is public housing. Once it got out of the housing business and began to turn people's housing needs over to the market, that's when the Hunger Games really began. Just returning to that question of like solutions and getting people into homes they don't already have. The biggest solution I point to in the book is what is called social housing. And social housing is really like public housing done right. Social housing is a model that has been hugely successful in cities like Vienna or in a country like Finland, where homelessness has been effectively ended, like not just visible homelessness, but all sorts of homelessness, through building, again, safe, dignified, permanently affordable housing on government-owned land, and where the government is owning this property, managing the property, and basically removing housing from the hands of speculators and profiteers. You know, often when we talk about public housing, you'll hear about the failure of public housing. But public housing didn't fail. It was set up to fail. It was systematically decimated. It was systematically defunded. And then we have the audacity to say that public housing failed. So social housing is basically public housing without the stigma that was attached to public housing, without the racism that gutted public housing. And yeah, I think that when I point to the true severity and scale of homelessness in this country, that, you know, and I took like not just visible homelessness, but all sorts of homelessness, through building, again, safe, dignified, permanently affordable housing on government-owned land, and where the government is owning this property, managing the property, and basically removing housing from the hands of speculators and profiteers. You know, often when we talk about it being 6 times greater than the official number, that's not just meant to catastrophize. It's meant to say, look at how big this is. Look at how big this catastrophe is. And let's not kid ourselves any longer that these, 15% apartments at 80% AMI, 60% AMI, a few tiny homes over here, a few supportive housing units, so that this is addressing this crisis at scale. The only thing that will address it at scale, I believe, is social housing. Once we have that societal paradigm shift around basic questions of like, what is housing for? Who is it for? What should be the sort of cost of housing? Once we answer those basic questions, I think the only real solution that meets this problem at scale is social housing.
Yeah, you sort of mentioned like social housing and how it's been successful in other countries. I guess, do you see any sort of impending like obstacles to that? Because it's clearly worked over there and it's gotten rid of homelessness all across the board. But yeah, I guess, is there anything, I guess, in addition to that, implementing that social housing, is there anything else that we would need to like address in order to make sure that it is successful and that it actually combats the problem?
I mean, it can seem hopelessly utopian and out of touch to be talking about a right to housing, to be talking about social housing at a moment like we're living through currently, at a moment that we're living through it today. When I finished reporting this book and finished writing it, it was before this new Trump administration began, and part of me felt like, will this book still be relevant by the time it's published, Because there actually were really ambitious proposals being made to address the homelessness, especially the housing affordability crisis, not necessarily in the ways that I'm describing, but in ways that would have made a difference. And what we've seen instead over the last several months of this administration is gasoline being poured on an already devastating situation. And I think that people can hear me talk about social housing or housing as a human right and say, well, that's great, but they're trying to round people up right now and forcibly institutionalize them. They're building camps where there's a very good chance unhoused people will be forcibly sent to in order to get homelessness out of sight and out of mind in America. So I think that is really the reality we're looking at. We're looking at a reality where HUD is, these already minimal resources are going away. Before this administration, 1 out of every 4 families who qualified for Section 8 housing actually received it. And now that number could become very easily 1 out of 10, 1 out of 15. So that's the reality that we're looking at. And I think that to the question of what obstacles exist to making social housing a reality, I think that I think those are the obstacles are that we're moving even further away from the kind of reckoning that I think is necessary to truly affect meaningful change. Having said that, though, I don't think it's all hopeless. I've talked about a vibrant tenant rights movement that is continuing to gain steam and gain momentum. Much of housing and homelessness policy in this country is done at the federal level, but a lot of it is also shaped at the state and local level as well. In Seattle, for instance, recently, voters decided to fund a social housing developer for the city of Seattle. So we're seeing social housing slowly become a reality in particular cities. Montgomery County in Maryland has also been experimenting with social housing initiatives. So there is progress being made because I think housing affordability is something that cuts across partisan lines, red state, blue state, and people want their kids to be able to have homes to live in. People want to have homes themselves. They want to see that if they're working their butts off, they can actually afford a place to live. And so I do have hope that even though this administration seems so determined to take an already catastrophic situation and make it even worse, that won't necessarily have to be the case at the local level.
Yeah, that's obviously something that's not within our control, but also, like you'd mentioned, focusing on things that are within our control. And the one thing that stands out is our power, right? Us organizing, getting together, tenants recognizing changes within your own hands. So yeah, I think you reinforced that really well. So how has, completing this book, at least immersing yourself in these families' lives, how has that affected you personally and sort of changed your worldview?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer because I'm still really processing what I witnessed during this time, and it was some of the most harrowing and heart-wrenching stuff imaginable, especially with the kids, to see the effect that what public health researchers call toxic stress, to see the immediate impact that this toxic stress was having on kids like DJ, like Sky. It was really, really hard. And I think it was also just really hard to see how the parents, Michelle, Celeste, Britt, Maurice and Natalia, Carrot, to see how even though intellectually, rationally, they understood that this was not their fault, there was still so much shame they continued to carry throughout this process. And I think that was that in some ways that was most heartbreaking for me because they blamed themselves. And even though we would sit and talk and I would talk about all these larger forces that, again, were just actively militating against their security at every turn. These business models that were profiting off of their insecurity at every turn and exacerbating their insecurity, even though they kind of saw that and could even get angry about it. At the end of the day, they felt a great deal of shame that they couldn't provide for their children in the way they wanted to. And so all of that, how has that affected me? I mean, I don't know. My dominant emotion throughout this process was just, honestly, it was anger. It was a feeling of rage that we have allowed in the richest nation on earth, that we have allowed this to happen, not just to a handful of people, but to realize that these families I was writing about and following are just representative of this enormous number of people in this country. To recognize the ways that this is not colorblind. In a city like Atlanta, which is no longer majority Black, 93% of the families experiencing homelessness are Black. And how did that statistic come to be? It didn't emerge overnight. There's an entire history of displacement, dispossession, and discrimination that has produced that statistic, going back to the end of slavery and millions of people being forced into a labor economy where they were systematically deprived of ownership rights, property rights, and were forced into an economy of low wages, rent, and debt. And just to see the ways that that has continued over the generations, just that entire picture and the visceral everyday reality made me feel enraged so much. And after anger, the dominant emotion was just grief and sadness. And so I think I'm still trying to just come to terms with what I saw. You know, seeing nearly a dozen families evicted at gunpoint from this extended stay hotel during the pandemic when they had lost their jobs, when the working homeless became the formerly working homeless because they no longer could go to work. And this hotel hires this private militia, in effect, to evict them from their hotel rooms at gunpoint, putting guns in the faces of their kids. And so seeing that and seeing how their experiences were almost completely off the radar of both political parties in this country, of leaders, not only at the level of federal government, but our city government as well. It was very heartbreaking. And I know that the way I'm talking is not how a journalist is supposed to talk. I'm supposed to be more dispassionate and kind of, just observing, just letting you know the facts. But I would be lying if I said that I wasn't deeply, deeply changed by this reporting. And my hope is that readers who pick up this book will be similarly outraged and similarly changed.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I can't even imagine how you're seeing this reality hidden from plain sight that people are dealing with. It's like something that others aren't necessarily like truly aware of, and it is frustrating because you want to bring light to it. And I think that's something you do really well in this book. I think it's an important step in getting people to care and to, like you said, get enraged about it because it's really important. Do you in the future hope to follow other families or work in other cities or countries or share more stories?
Yeah, I'm not sure what's next for me, but I do know that the book came out at the end of March, so it's been several months now of talking about these issues. I do know that, if anything, I only feel like a more heightened urgency. The stakes feel even higher right now than even when the book came out. And so I think I'm just committed at this point to getting the message out, to giving these families and their stories a platform, and really being guided by the conviction. As Sarah Nelson, she's the head of the flight attendant union in America. She's a kind of labor dynamo. Something she said to me when we were in conversation at a bookstore during the book tour, she said to me, in reading the book, it occurred to her that before we can fix the crisis, we have to feel the crisis. I think many people who have been working in homeless services or in the affordable housing space or in housing policy can sort of even themselves lose sight of the immediacy, the visceral reality of what it's like to go through this. And those voices the voices of people like Celeste are often left out of the discussion about housing policy and homelessness. And I think if this book accomplishes anything, it will allow people to feel the crisis, which will hopefully allow them to want to fix it as well. But yeah, at this point, I'm really just wanting to get that message out to anyone who will listen. And I just feel like my modest contribution to all of this is just like having spent years with these families and followed them. Come with me, let's look at what it's like. Let's look at what it's like to travel with these families and see what it's like, and then see if your stereotypes remain intact. See if you then continue to say they just need to get a job, or if only they worked harder, or if they only made better decisions. See if you can still say those things. See if you can still blame homelessness on addiction or mental illness once you read these family stories. And because my hope is that those stereotypes and those perceptions, which have written at a bookstore during the book tour, she said to me, in reading the book, it occurred to her that before we can fix the crisis, we have to feel the crisis. I think many people who have been working in homeless services or in the affordable housing really been engineered. The narrative around homelessness was shaped very intentionally by successive governments in this country. And my hope is that in following these family stories, that perception will begin to sort of be dismantled in favor of what is actually happening.
Yeah, and you certainly have. By highlighting these stories, I think it's just like bringing us one step closer to disrupting those, sort of stereotypes that homelessness is a personal choice, or, all you have to really do is get a job. Clearly, you can have a job and still face homelessness. And so it's been really wonderful having you on, Brian. Thank you for all the important work that you're doing and getting the word out there. I think it's riveting, and it's like it's building momentum. And so
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your wonderful questions and a really great conversation.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode. The episode was hosted by me, Hannah Nabraha, produced by Baron Mello. The audio and video editing was done by Ilona Tuominen, and the music is courtesy of Diego Urquela. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to The Bells I Hear and follow us on social media at The Bells I Hear to find more content and to spread the word. Thanks again. Till next time.